which demands rigorous honesty.
Okay, guys, we've been studying the 9th chapter, Family Afterward, and we're nearly finished with the chapter. And today we're going to, I believe we're going to pick up on page 133. Before we do that, let's review a little bit. Some of us have not been here through the whole chapter. This chapter is one that ought not to ever be ignored. It's extremely important. There's so much wonderful material in here. A lot of it has to do, of course, with first step, because it's describing a lot of the symptomology of the disease of alcoholism. But for the most part, of course, it really deals with the alcoholic in recovery and his or her family, and the interrelationships and the interreactions between the alcoholic and his family, and what they need to do to mutually support each other. And at first, of course, the family is going to consider that they don't need any support. They just need to have a sober father or a sober mother, husband or wife. But that's not true, because a lot of damage has been done. And remember that this chapter was not written from the standpoint of theory. It's not a bunch of philosophy or opinions. This chapter was written right out of experience. Because you see, in the time that this book was being written, in 1939, 1940, it was the practice to have the families meet together. And their meetings were almost all held in private homes. And there was coffee, and there were cookies and cakes, and there was talk that went on sometimes for hours and hours. They didn't have these artificial time limits on meetings as we do now. If you've led a meeting lately and you went 1 minute over, you know how vicious it can become. And for God's sakes, don't forget anything in the printed program, you know. Somebody's bound to have a conniption. They weren't bound by those kinds of restrictions. You see, what they were doing was, a lot of what they were doing was experimentation. They were finding out what would work and what did not work, not only with themselves, but in terms of the program. And a lot of what they were finding out was that there was a critical factor involved in the recovery of the alcoholic, and that critical factor was his or her family. For one thing, it became really clear in the early days that the family had been badly burned by alcohol and by the actions of the alcoholic, and that there in many cases were very serious gulfs and breaches and chasms between the alcoholic and his family, especially with the kids. And the big book, as we'll see a little bit later, addresses this very significant problem, how seriously the children are affected or had been affected. As we read in chapter 8, the chapter of the wives, what happened here was that they discovered together that the non-alcoholics needed the 12 steps. Remember reading about that back in the chapter of the wives, when the big book clearly states that as our husbands began to apply spiritual principles in their lives, we found the necessity of doing so too. Because the wives found that they had the same defects of character their husbands did, they just didn't drink over them. They found that they needed the serenity, the happiness and joyousness and freedom that is the end product of surrender and obedience to a higher power, just as much as their husbands did. And of course, out of that revelation, out of that experience, came the Al-Anon family groups. If you don't know about Al-Anon, it is a 12-step centered program. And it is the direct result of what happened in those early days. So when it came time to write the big book, it was Bill's decision to approach this problem directly. Now, we might think in terms of the family afterward as being a manual for the family to operate with so that they are less affected and more understanding of the alcoholic in recovery. And to some extent, of course, that's true. But it has a much deeper object. And that deeper object is to pull the family into the ambit of the steps. And it's quite successful in doing so for anybody who bothers to read it. You might also ask yourself this question, just as in a little aside: what would be the point of this chapter, The Family Afterward, if the alcoholic would be required to abandon his family for 1 year because he was not permitted to have any kind of a sexual liaison? Well, obviously they didn't know that back then. People who know it today are so far off base, I actually have to feel sorry for them. But in any event, this chapter was written to pull the family together, not in the psychological sense, not that everybody is entitled to their feelings and you got to talk it out and all that stuff. To pull them together in a spiritual sense. Because you see, that's the only thing we know. We're not psychologists here, psychiatrists. We don't practice any of that. What we do have is a lot of experience seeking knowledge of and surrender to a power greater than ourselves, which then solves our problem. And those of us who have done that know that it solves our problems. It just does. And so our job is to help the next person who comes along get on that path and stay there, and to encourage them to do so, and to help them, and to teach them. The same thing turns out to be equally applicable in the family. The 12 steps, as it turns out, are not our exclusive property. We don't own them. We have no pride of authorship. We have no patent on them or copyright. Quite the contrary, the 12 steps are for everyone, every single human being, because they are universal principles, apply to everybody. There's a big, big difference, however, and this is the one that has kept the steps from becoming of universal application, except in those instances where people have been driven to their knees by one form of human problem or another. It takes a lot of courage to work the steps, and it takes a lot of motivation to even want to work the steps. And for the most part, people just simply don't have that. They don't see the necessity for this kind of a radical change in their lives, especially the business of giving up, this business of the third step, where we decide that hereafter, in this drama of life, God is going to be our director. He will be the principal and we the agent. He is the father and we are the child. And this is a drastic step away from a self-directed life. If you stop and think about it, probably most of us had exactly the same experience growing up, or even into our teens or early 20s, because people were advising us about how we were to live our lives. And most of the advice that we got was a lie. It wasn't intentional, but it was nevertheless a lie. Because we were being told that in order to be happy and secure, it was necessary for us to exercise a high degree of control, that we were to get an education, that we were to get a career and follow it, that we were to make lots of money because money equals a certain degree of security and power, that we were to accumulate lots of money, and that we were to accumulate lots of things, because things are the outward demonstration of our success and our power, and they tend to keep other people in line. They may be jealous of us, they may hate us for what we have, but they will respect us. So that being respected turned out to be a hell of a lot more important than being loved. And also, we were to learn how to manipulate, capture, and deal with people so that we can get them to do what we want. And all this sounds great. The problem is it doesn't work. And many of us were able to arrive at this juncture because we worked hard to get there. I was one of them. I got the education, I had the career, I was making the money, and I was a miserable SOB. I had the family, and I had the kids, I had a crazy wife, but I could discount that. But there was something dreadfully wrong, and I didn't know what it was. I know now. See, what happens is this. The more we accumulate on a human plane, the more fear sets in. Because we become afraid that we're going to lose what we have. We become afraid that we're not going to get what we want or need. We become very much afraid of being rejected or shunned. We become afraid of failure. Oh, failure. Our pride is sitting up here like this. Remember that pride is the godfather of all of our defects. And pride is already sending fear out as a hitman in all directions to kill us. So what happens is that our fears eventually overwhelm us. We're not really aware of it. But in the process of being overwhelmed by fear, what's happening is that all of our natural instincts are blown out of the water. They're warped and perverted to a point where they stop working for us and they work against us. The sex instinct goes nuts. The instinct for society, we have to be top dog. We have to be in the middle of things. We have to be accepted. We have to be the hero. We have to have our name in lights. And the instinct for security, and we feel paranoid. And we don't know what's going on, except that what's happened here is that our natural instincts being totally warped out of what God gave us, we become loaded with what the big book and our program call defects of character. That's what defects of character are. They're the warping and perversion of our natural instincts. It had absolutely nothing to do with sin, deadly or otherwise. It's an absolute, yes.
I'm going on 7 months next week.
Well, good.
And, I was wondering, do those instincts that are warped, do they get corrected?
Do they get what?
Do those instincts that are warped get corrected over time?
Oh, of course they do. But we have some work we have to do to make sure that that happens. What do you suppose the 7-step prayer is all about? Take away my defects, right? All the defects which stand in the way of my service to you and my fellows. The 6th step, we become entirely ready. All those defects be removed, don't we? Which means that our natural God-given instincts come back into place the way they're supposed to be in the first place. If that weren't true, none of us would ever recover. What does it tell us? That when the spiritual malady is overcome, we will straighten out mentally and physically. And straightening out mentally, it means precisely that we no longer are struggling with warped natural instincts. Now, an instinct is a very dangerous thing to screw around with. because it operates from the lizard brain. It doesn't operate from on a conscious level. So we're being driven by stuff that we don't have any control over. That's why we have to understand that we have no power over these defects. Everybody out there, these human solutions, keep saying, work on your defects, work on your defects. Well, how the hell are you going to do that? How do you work on something you have no control over? Never could figure that one out. But God does that for us. And not just little piecemeal stuff like some of these folks are saying, oh, that'll happen if you got doubts. If somebody's convinced you that God doesn't take away all your defects at once, you're going to have to keep on working on them all the rest of your life. Well, then you say, oh, well, that's true. So now you close your mind. You're no longer open to the grace, right? You make, as soon as we put limitations on God's power to act in our lives, we limit ourselves, don't we? So we leave that door wide open. We say, here I am, God. Use me, take away these defects so that I can be of maximum service to you and my fellows. That's the prayer, isn't it? No equivocation there. We don't reserve anything to ourselves. There's some wise guys around who always like to make the exception. Well, anybody here tell me that they really want to do away with lust? And then everybody's kind of intimidated. And I would say, yeah, I do. If I had any, I'd want to be free of it. But you see what, we walk into these traps, semantic traps, and they're deadly because by doing that we lose sight of the reality, the truth. We lose sight of our present reality, which is the only thing we have, and the only thing we have to deal with. What we have to deal with is a lack of power. The lack of power is the lack of power over our thinking. Not over our actions, our thinking. Our minds are a cesspool. We've been pouring all kinds of chemicals into them for years, and we couldn't clean those rascals up. So now we got to pull the plug and drain it out altogether. We start over again. Fill it all with fresh new water, keep it clean, right? That's why it says we were reborn. That our whole attitude and outlook on life will change, and that's exactly why. And that's what the steps do. Your answer to your question is yes, Virginia, there is a Santa Claus.
Thank you.
Okie dokie. So this is why when we look at everybody else out there, guys, the big book admonishes us that we are to look at them as having the same defects that we have. Maybe not in exactly the same order, maybe not in exactly the same amplitude, but nevertheless the same defects. Now, once in a while, I'm certain the history tells us that there will be a Mother Teresa once in a while. But for the most part, everybody's out there living a life which is under constant attack. And this is the same thing that's going to happen to us. The world and all of its people continue to threaten us. And threat will always translate to fear. And it is the fear that warps our natural instincts. That's why we have a 10th step. It isn't that God didn't take away the defects we walked in the door with. It's because this stuff pops up all the time. And each day we have to stay ahead of it. We have to be aware of what's going on. If I get angry, and I get angry at Sharon. I probably wouldn't because she's such an awfully nice lady, but suppose I did. It would only be because she threatened me in some way. And because of that threat, there's a fear. I'm not even aware of it most of the time, but I'm angry at her because she's threatened me. See, this is what happened when the steps were being developed in those 3.5 years before the Big Book. There was no 10th step in the Oxford group. Their 6 steps did not encompass this very real fact of the continuation of threat, just as a matter of being out there living in a world that's full of threat. Because the Oxfordians believed that once having worked their 6 steps, they became perfect. And our guys found out they didn't. You guys may be, but we don't. That's why those disclaimers we hear every time we hear chapter 5 being read. We're not saints. We don't claim spiritual perfection. Well, we do claim spiritual progress, and boy, we'd better be able to claim that, because it's the only thing that's going to save our butts. Spiritual progress is the only thing that keeps us spiritually fit, because you can't go back and you can't stand still. When we boil all of this down, then we've got something which requires of us that we constantly stay aware of what's going on in our lives and what our present reality is, so that we can deal with it on the present tense and not let the pony poops pile up. You can sit around waiting for a month and procrastinating, and you wake up one day and you're buried. And so when we look then at this question of defects, and we realize that everybody has them, that we are not alone in this world, that the defects of character are the product of pride, and fear being the product of the pride, and the fear having warped the natural instincts, and these are people are all around us. This doesn't make anybody a bad person. Some are, but it doesn't make them bad. It just means that we have to be aware what's going on. And that's why when we look at the harm that has been done to us, when we do our resentment list, we have to come to recognize that that harm was done by people who are sick, just as we are sick. Same illness, same soul sickness. And so we pray for them. And in praying for them, we're set free from the resentment. You see, the spiritual remedy always recognizes the truth, not the wishful thinking of the human solutionist. There's no way to be rid of a resentment by pretending that a pillow is Papa. Take this, Papa. Boom, boom, boom. But when I have done the work to find out what Papa did, and I've got it all down here in black and white, and it's out of my head now, it's down on paper where I can look at it, and I can say to myself, well, he did a lot of bad stuff, but I believe the big book is right when it says that he was sick. I also believe the big book is right when it tells me that the solution to be free of my resentments I've been carrying for the last 35 years is to pray for Papa, even though he's now in that great meeting up in the sky, hopefully, or maybe somewhere else, but at least I'm going to pray for him, and I'm going to ask God to give him everything I would want for myself when I pass on. And I don't want to do it. All right, the big book says if you don't want to do it for 2 weeks anyway. And when you get done after 2 weeks, you will find you have come to mean it and to want it for him. And you will have exchanged the anger and resentment and rage for love. Because you see, it's quite obvious that we cannot pray for somebody and hate him at the same time. Sooner or later, the prayer supplants the hate with love. And we have all these tools to work with. Well, now, these tools are not our exclusive property, and this chapter recognizes that. And it's saying, well, for example, remember back there in chapter 7, we were reading that one sentence, which is the only sentence in the big book that defines sponsorship. There's only that one sentence. Both you and the new man must walk day by day in the path of spiritual progress. That's sponsorship. Two people growing spiritually together. One sharing experience, strength, and hope with the other, and teaching, but both growing spiritually. And if that mutual spiritual growth is not there, it's not sponsorship. It's some kind of sick control deal or ego trip. And so if we put this whole thing back in the place of the family, we see exactly what the big book's saying. Let's take the whole family, let them walk day by day in the path of spiritual progress. See what this is saying? Everybody wins. And so this chapter is primarily, and almost to the nth degree, an appeal, not only to us as the alcoholic, but to the rest of the family, to seriously consider this way of life. And boy, does it ever work. And they found out it worked. So when this chapter was written, it wasn't written as some kind of an idea. It was written from experience. See, by this time, they had begun to do exactly this. Now, this chapter also contains some absolutely marvelous stuff that isn't anywhere else in the book. I want to just remind you of a couple of them. Let's go to page 130. First full paragraph. Those of us who have spent much time in the world of spiritual make-believe have eventually seen the childishness of it. This dream world has been replaced by a great sense of purpose, accompanied by a growing consciousness of the power of God in our lives. We have come to believe He would like us to keep our heads in the clouds with Him, but that our feet ought to be firmly planted on earth. That is where our fellow travelers are, and that is where our work must be done. These are the realities for us. We found nothing incompatible between a powerful spiritual experience and a life of sane and happy usefulness. Isn't that not a beautiful paragraph? That's one we can all profitably meditate upon. But just think what it's saying. We ask God in the third step prayer to release us from the bondage of self. Visualize the chains and ropes that hold our spirit in a psychic fetal position being broken. And now our spirit can soar with the angels. But the big book is saying, don't get too high on this. Have your head in the clouds with God. That's where it belongs. Be with Him. Keep your feet firmly planted on earth, because this is where your work is. Remember what the big book tells us, that our real purpose here is to fit ourselves to be of maximum service to God and the people about us. Period. And also that there is nothing incompatible between these two concepts, and that we get to have a life of sane and happy usefulness. And then, go over to page 133. Top of the page. And all this is stuff that we hear all the time, but mostly, if we're not reminded, we don't even know where it came from, the big book, because nobody ever pays any attention to this chapter. Except us, we've been paying attention to it for a long time already. But that's because we're really trying to understand this book and what it's telling us. Top of page 133. The first full sentence, 2 lines down from the top, in the second line. This is an expression of God's will for us. We say, what's God's will for me? How would I know? Big book is telling you right here. We are sure God wants us to be happy, joyous, and free. That's our heritage. That's what God wants of us. That's what He wants for us. But we have to work for it. It isn't something that's given gratis. It's something that is a product of the spiritual awakening. Happiness, joyousness, and freedom. A product of the spiritual awakening for which we've worked very hard. But we get to have it, and it's there for all of us. And of those 3, what is the greatest of the 3 out of happiness, joyousness, and freedom? I believe is freedom. Freedom from the bondage of self. Freedom to make those choices between right and wrong and not be driven by decisions based on self as we always have been in the past. And then it goes on with something more here that's very profound. We cannot subscribe to the belief that this life is a vale of tears, though it once was just that for many of us. But it is clear we made our own misery. God didn't do it. Now, how many times, a lot of you are very experienced 12-steppers and sponsors, and you know So often you hear newcomers come in and talk about how they're mad at God. And God did this and God did that. Or they're mad at their family because they're dysfunctional. Or they're mad at Uncle Joe because he abused them at one time. They're mad at this, mad at that, mad at the world, mad at the circumstances of their birth. And all this stuff has been heaped on their heads to a point where they believe it, and believing it, they absolutely know that they've got no responsibility for any of this. And that's a deadly place to be, because you see, until we are willing to accept the responsibility for what's happened to us, until we understand the truth that we are the authors of our own misery, that our problems of our own making, that they arise out of ourselves, that we are extreme examples of self-will run riot. As it says in chapter 4, self-imposed crisis. It's a hard pill to swallow, because you see, what happens here is it takes away all of our excuses. We no longer have these excuses for our crapped out behavior. We no longer get to go and do whatever it is we decide and then blame it on our illness, or blame it on our dysfunctional family, or blame it on this, blame it on that. I missed my injection this week. I've got an imbalance of salts. I've got my whole cocktail of 7 prescriptions here, and one of them ran out. It's no wonder I'm acting like a crazy fool. And don't we just love to have these excuses? Don't we just eat it up when somebody is willing to tell us, it's not your fault? Good dog, good puppy. We love it. And then we can run out and tell everybody, hey, don't blame me for all this stuff I did. It's your fault. You're dysfunctional. Remember I told you about that book, came out right after the treatment center started pandering this stuff of dysfunction, called I'm Dysfunctional, You're Dysfunctional. We're all dysfunctional. True, we are all dysfunctional in that sense. But I thought that was kind of cute, because how you see that the dysfunction then loses all of its kick, because if I can't blame you, and I got to start looking at myself as being dysfunctional, then I kind of lose my excuses. And we love excuses. The first time I heard that I had a disease, I said, hallelujah, that's what the problem is, I'm sick. It's not my fault I did all this stuff. I was disabused about that in about 30 seconds by my sponsor. Yes, dear.
Jim, I don't understand the last thing you said.
About what?
I mean, that we do have a disease.
Oh, yes. Yes, and certainly, and it's a disease which is incurable, and it's invariably deadly, and it's progressive. But, here's what you got to remember. And let me just finish, because it's a tremendously important question you've asked. I'd like you to go to page 45, Don. I want to show you something. You got it? Mm-hmm. All right. The first full paragraph, about a quarter of the way down the page. We think that our problem is alcoholism, and yet alcohol is only a symptom. What is our real problem? Lack of power.
Page 45, first paragraph.
Page 4-5.
Lack of power.
Lack of power. That was our dilemma. You see, we had to find a power by which we could live, which means as opposed to die, and it had to be a power greater than ourselves. Where and how are we to find this power? Now let's see what this book's all about. Well, that's exactly what this book is about. Its main object is to enable you to find a power greater than yourself which will solve your problem. 2 lines down it says this means we're going to talk about God. Now let me explain how that fits into your question. It does not tell us that we are powerless over our actions. We're powerless over our thinking. We're powerless over the obsession, compulsion to drink alcohol. We're powerless over other aspects of our insanity. All this has to do with our thinking. It never implies nor does it state that we're powerless over our actions. We have been making and taking action based upon self, based upon violations of our own moral and ethical code for years and years and years, knowing we were doing it. Alcoholism is not an excuse for that. And we can't use the disease to excuse the things that we did, knowing they were wrong when we did them. The disease has to do with our thinking, and of course there's a contributing factor there, and the fact that we're insane, certainly there's a contributing factor there. But think how destructive it would be of our whole program if we decided that because we're alcoholics, we have an excuse for all the stuff we did. And that we did not have to take responsibility for any of it. Because, see, that's not true at all. Does that answer your question?
Sort of, but can I just
Of course.
elaborate 2 sentences?
Of course.
My husband asked me this weekend why I went back out and took pills. And I got drug tested at Up My Airline, and I tested positive. I found out on Friday. And tomorrow I go in to find out what's going to happen.
Yes.
This is my job of 19 years. My husband said, I don't understand how you could have done this knowing that you may get drug tested and lose your job. And I told him, but it's a disease I have, and this is what happens sometimes with an addict is they relapse, and I don't have control over my obsessions and compulsions. Is that an excuse?
I misunderstood your question. Turn to page 24. You got it? Page 24?
Yes.
Just a substitute addict for alcoholic, okay? Fact is that most alcoholics, for reasons yet obscure, have lost the power of choice in drink. Our so-called willpower becomes practically non-existent. Listen to this now. We are unable at certain times to bring into our consciousness with sufficient force the memory of the suffering and humiliation of even a week or a month ago. We are without defense against the first drink. That is one of the hallmarks of the disease. That's why we talk about it as being an insanity. Let's take a look over here in the third chapter. There's more. Page 39. Go down about 5-6 lines on the top of the page. The actual or potential alcoholic, with hardly exception, will be absolutely unable to stop drinking on the basis of self-knowledge. This is a point we wish to establish and re-emphasize, to smash home. Let's go over here now to page 41. This is the story of Fred, one of the brightest guys who ever, page 41. He was a member of a very prestigious CPA firm in New York, and he was bright. He had a fine family. He had lots of money. He had everything going for him, except he was a drunk. He went to Washington and for no reason at all got drunk. Go down to the bottom of page 41. Go up about 7 or 8 lines from the bottom of the page. Not only had I been off guard, I had made no fight whatever against the first drink. This time I had not thought of the consequences at all. I had commenced to drink as carelessly as though the cocktails were ginger ale. Now listen to this, Donna. I now remembered that my alcoholic friends had told me how they prophesied that if I had an alcoholic mind, the time and place would come I would drink again. They had said that though I did raise a defense, it would one day give way before some trivial reason for having a drink. Well, just that did happen and more, for what I had learned of alcoholism did not occur to me at all. I knew from that moment that I had an alcoholic mind. I saw, Donna, that willpower and self-knowledge would not help in those strange mental blank spots. Those strange mental blank spots, okay? Now there's more, but those are some samplings of what the truth is. Now, because you're not talking here about actions you take which are rational. And we're talking here about one of the most critical aspects of the disease, which is we're insane. It's pure insanity that we will take the next drink or take the next drug knowing what the consequences are going to be, because we are afflicted with this disease which drives us. And the obsession and compulsion to drink or to drug is more powerful than we are. That's what it means when we say powerless. That's why we have no protection except to put a loving God between ourselves and the booze or the drugs. And your fault, if any there may be, is that you did not see to it that you had God solidly between you and the drugs. That's where you may have responsibility. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does.
All right, let's open our books up to page 134, please. Now, if people had known this was coming, there'd have been a whole lot bigger turnout today.
Sex? We're talking about sex.
Every time I do a step series, I make sure everybody knows that next week we're going to be looking at sex crimes.
Yeah.
And they all show up. All right, let's see what this has to say. A word about sex relations. Alcohol is so sexually stimulating to some men. Oh, come on, Bill. To some men, that they have overindulged. What a neat way of putting it.
Overindulged.
You know, in Bill's story, he literally admitted being too drunk to do it. Let's see if we can find that. It's in his story here somewhere. Okay, that floored me. Let's go on. One more back.
Maybe Lois wrote it.
Page 3.
Is it page 3? Oh, good. You got it marked. That's right. That's good. Okay, let's see. Oh, yeah, here it is on page 3. Next to last paragraph, about 7-8 lines up in the bottom. There were many unhappy scenes in our sumptuous apartment. There had been no real infidelity.
The artificial type.
Yes. I don't know whether in 30s they had artificial. I guess they probably did. For loyalty to my wife, helped at times by extreme drunkenness, kept me out of these scrapes. Which means, of course, that, well, at least in my warped mind, I believe he just couldn't get it up. He was too drunk. And so, anyway, what about women?
Yeah.
Sexually stimulating to some men. How about women? Well, I can't say I have any experience with that at all, but I never met a woman who was impotent, however. In any event, that certainly is the truth of it. Unless the reason is understood, there may be an emotional upset. Some of us had this experience only to enjoy in a few months of finer intimacy than ever. There should be no hesitancy in consulting a doctor or a psychologist if the condition persists. We do not know of many cases where this difficulty lasted long. Every time I read that last sentence, I say to myself, how in the hell do you know, Bill? I mean, you guys all sat around talking about whether you were still impotent or not. I don't know. I think he took a little poetic license there myself, or unpoetic license. Now then, this whole business of sex, of course, is covered very thoroughly in our 4-step, or it ought to have been. Yes,
Can I ask a question?
absolutely.
I have heard rumors that after Bill W. got sober that he never gave up women, that he just played around on his wife all the time. Have you ever heard anything like that?
Sure.
Okay. All right.
Apocryphal, but I've heard of them.
Okay.
Who the heck knows? I mean, I've never. One of my sponsors was his sponsee, and I didn't know Bill well, but I'd met him several times. Of course, by the time I got to know him in the late '60s, he was getting on toward his time of his death. But there's never been anything, in by the way, a proof of that. But knowing a little bit about Bill and the stories I've heard, it would not surprise me at all. Because he was an egoist and a power driver. And women flocked around him. He was not a bad-looking guy. He was big, he was tall. And in the early 50s and in the 40s, he exuded an awful lot of power. Because he was the grand guru. I mean, he was it. Which darn near killed him, you know, because the Young Turks came along and they started shoving him out, and he was so dependent on his position in the fellowship that when that started happening, he got real sick. He was very depressed, was suicidal, was taking LSD, trying to become a Catholic, all kinds of weird stuff going on. Well, I don't mean becoming a Catholic is weird.
Oh, no.
That, anything but that.
Anything.
In that order, LSD,
I think he was taking instruction from the Archbishop of New York, and it didn't work. He eventually had to give it up because he just couldn't. He wasn't willing to buy into all the stuff that he had to do in order to become a Catholic. Much to the dismay of Father Ed, you know, because Father Ed was his sort of his half-ass sponsor. Excuse my language. He really was. I mean, that was a pretty good description. This guy, Father Ed, was a Jesuit who lived in St. Louis. He was not a member of the fellowship. He was not an alcoholic, but he stuck his nose into everything, and he was supposedly the guy who got AA started in St. Louis. He had a whole lot to do with writing the 12 and 12. In fact, if you read a book called I think it's called The Heart of Sponsorship. It's a book which is a collection of the letters back and forth between Bill Wilson and Father Ed, in which Bill was transmitting chapters of the 12 and 12 that he had roughed out to Father Ed, and Ed was editing them and then rewriting them. For example, you'll find in there that Ed was primarily responsible for the chapter on the 6th step and also on the 7th step. And those kooky ideas that show up in those 2 steps, those are his ideas, not Bill's. They're directly contrary to the big book, and it caused an awful lot of grief. But you see, Bill at that time, still in 1952, 53, he was still strong enough in the fellowship as a guru that they didn't edit what he wrote. Even though at the time everybody who had been around for a while and knew what the big book said was aghast at what he'd written. But fortunately, he had prefaced the whole thing by saying these are essays. And nowhere in the 12 and 12 did he try to tell us how to work the steps. So he just wrote about them. There were times, there's one letter he wrote to Father Ed in which he admitted that he was so depressed and so suicidal that he could only finish one sentence at a time in writing the 12 and 12. And if you notice, his writings for the Grapevine fell off entirely during that time. You'll find some writings before that up to 1950, and then they pick up about 1958. And what happened was that Bill was so dependent upon the fellowship that when they began to push him out, he just went all to pieces, because that was his whole life. And he had to come to terms with that. And matter of fact, he wrote something about that that's become kind of a classic. There was an article called Toward Emotional Sobriety, which was published in the Grapevine.
The toward?
Huh? Toward Emotional Sobriety.
Toward.
Does it say something? Thanks, Dick.
Let's see if I can find what he wrote here, because it's also reproduced in the in As Bill Sees It. Here's what he wrote, and you'll find this if you have a Language of the Heart on page 268. If we examine every disturbance we have, great or small, we will find at the root of it some unhealthy dependency and its consequent unhealthy demand. Let us, with God's help, continually surrender these hobbling demands. Then we can be set free to live and love. We may be able to 12-step ourselves and others into emotional sobriety. Now, here's what he said about it. My basic flaw had always been dependence, almost absolute dependence on people or circumstances to supply me with prestige, security, and the like. Failing to get these things according to my perfectionist dreams and specifications, I have fought for them, and when defeat came, so did my depression. There wasn't a chance of making the outgoing love of St. Francis a workable and joyous way of life until these fatal and almost absolute dependencies were cut away. Because I had over the years undergone a little spiritual development, the absolute quality of these frightful dependencies had never before been so starkly revealed. Reinforced by what grace I could secure in prayer, I found I had to exert every ounce of will and action to cut off these faulty emotional dependencies upon people, especially upon AA, indeed upon any set of circumstances whatsoever. Then only could I be free to love as Francis had. Emotional and instinctual satisfactions I saw were really the extra dividends of having love, offering love, and expressing love appropriate to each relation in life. Now, not most people in fellowship don't understand what happened here, because, you got to do a little reading and pay a little bit of attention. But when we do understand that, then we can see why it's an utter waste of time to try to do the 12 steps by the 12 and 12, because there's nothing in there that tells you how to work them. But that's a bonanza for people who don't want to follow directions, who want to make up all their own stuff, which is what they do. You go to a so-called step meeting, and it's really a reading meeting. We read a step in the 12 and 12, and then we so-called discuss it. Did you ever listen to some of that discussion? It's got almost nothing to do with the steps. The steps, the directions for working the steps are all in the big book. That's where they are. And if you want to know how to work steps, open up your book, it's all there. Find somebody who's done it before and let them help you. And so when we look at something like this, we got to realize that this dependency is what damn near killed Bill, threw a monkey wrench into the fellowship. But, and this is the beautiful thing, as soon as Bill made up his mind to give up his position in AA to become the elder statesman, everything changed. that the dependency was gone and the depression was gone and the suicidal stuff was gone, and he no longer wanted to be a Catholic either.
Suicide Catholic.
Okay, yeah.
I got a question, Jim. Okay, so the 12 and 12 is still an effective piece of literature as far as just working the steps. I mean, you still need the 12 and 12 if you reference it from the big book, correct?
What?
Well, if you're talking about that particular step, say with a sponsee, or just because I'm leading a group meeting tomorrow that involves the step, for example, you know, if you reference it from the big book and say this is how you work that step, doesn't the actual 12 and 12 kind of narrow it, you know, your focus a little bit for those,
Oh.
you know, that particular
In some cases. But for example, well, I can give you a whole bunch of examples, but let's just take three. In the fourth step, the 12 and 12 talks about what we're looking for by way of defects is the 7 deadly sins. Balderdash.
Okay.
This isn't no damn religion.
Within the 12 and 12, you're saying, right?
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Go to the sixth step. The sixth step is the step that separates the men from the boys.
Yeah.
Total nonsense. The sixth step is stated in the past tense, or in the past perfect, that we were entirely ready. Doesn't say we made ourselves ready. Why? Because the fourth and fifth step is where we get ready to have God remove all these defects of character. There's only one solution if we don't happen to be ready at that point, and that's to pray for the willingness till it comes. That's it.
That's the sixth step.
The sixth step is nothing more than a transition between the fifth step and the seventh step. And it states a fact, not an action. The only action stated in the sixth step has to do with what happens if we're not ready to release one of our defects. In that case, before we can go on, we must pray for the willingness until it comes. Take the seventh step. The whole treatise on the seventh step and the 12 and 12 is on humility. It's got nothing to do with humility any more than any other prayer. It's a prayer. The third step prayer is offered up humbly. The fourth step, certainly the seventh step prayer. Certainly any prayers that we have, we should be approaching God with humility. It's got nothing more to do with humility than any other prayer. As a matter of fact, if you look at the big book and read it carefully, when you get to the fifth step, you will find that it's in the fifth step that we learn the humility we need, not the seventh step. Now, if you go to this book and you read, or the language of the heart, you find an article on humility. A whole article with 7 pages. Not once does it mention the seventh step. Because it's irrelevant. I mean, it was a total misdirection. Because it was something, you see, that Ed wanted to kick that in there.
That was the single,
That was his contribution.
Thing is 6 and 7,
You
right?
bet, exactly. But see, there, and you can go, there's all kinds of stuff in there. For example, the idea that pain is the touchstone of all spiritual progress. That's absolute nonsense. Because you see, unless you understand that touchstone means test, if you're in pain, there's a good chance that you're spiritually lacking. But the context of the sentence in the 12 and 12 is that we have to suffer pain in order to progress serious. And that's a Catholic concept, or a religious concept. It's not AA, and it certainly isn't true. Our spiritual progress is defined for us in the 11 steps, sought through prayer and meditation, to improve our conscious contact with God. There's nothing to do with pain. There's all kinds of stuff like that. You have to know what's in the big book, then you can find some good stuff in those essays. Because there is some really beautiful stuff in there. But there's a lot of stuff too that's just absolutely contrary to the big book and very confusing. If you're sponsoring people, you need to make sure that they understand that what they need to know is in the big book, and once they understand what's in the book, read the 12 and 12, but read it with discretion, understanding that there are many things in there which are simply contrary, directly contrary, diametrically opposed to the big book. And that's the problem. The biggest problem, however, is that if we rely upon the 12 and 12 to work the steps, it'll never, you can't do it. There's no directions in there for working.
Right?
If you're going to use the 12 and 12 and you're doing a meeting and that's the format, then certainly you would know what's in the big book, point out this is where the directions are, and maybe show some parallels. That certainly. But I would be real careful about it, because if you got new people in there, you get to confuse the hell out of them. You're saying one thing in the big book and something else over here in the 12 and 12. Which one is right? I don't know whether that's a good answer to you or not.
Well, yeah, you give me pause for thought. I have a whole 24 hours to contemplate.
Okay. Yes.
What is the purpose then of the 12 and 12 then, if not to confuse us?
Well, if you, one would almost think it was written to confuse, wouldn't one?
That's what it sounds like.
That wasn't the purpose at all. The original purpose was to turn Bill loose and let him philosophize and write some essays about the 12 steps. And unfortunately, in 1952, when he started doing that, he was a sick guy. And he screwed up, but he was screwing up because this Father Ed was doing this Svengali thing in the background, this gray eminence stuff out of St. Louis, where he was editing all this stuff and throwing all the Catholicism in there. All of his Jesuit ideas are showing up in there.
Starting at 6, right?
No, heck no, starting at 4.
Starting at 4? Okay.
Not only that, but we even at 11 we got St. Francis, right?
Yeah.
Ah, but St. Francis, he's a Catholic saint? Oh, yeah. And also, that's a sectarian prayer, isn't it? And we don't have sectarian prayers. There's no such thing as 11-step prayer. It can't be AA orthodoxy. For one thing, it talks of an afterlife, doesn't it? And we're not saying to anybody, you come in here, if you're going to do 11-step, you got to use this prayer. But maybe you don't believe in an afterlife. Maybe you're a Hindu or something. I don't know which one it would be. But, well, how can I use that prayer? Well, and then I look at it, and it says it's St. Francis's prayer. Wasn't he a Catholic saint? Yeah, but you're not a religion, right? No, we're not a religion. Well, how come this is the 11-step prayer? It is AA protocol. It's an official prayer of AA. Balderdash, it's not, never has been, never could be. But there are a lot of people who really believe it is.
But it does say in the big book to listen to religious people, read religious material.
You see where they were right.
Right, exactly. And listen to what they have to say, because they know a lot, blah, blah, blah.
No question about it, but it also is quite clear that we do not apply any of the religious strictures to AA. Certainly we listen. Certainly we need to learn from them. And we learned a lot, and an awful lot of the big book comes directly out of the writings of some major religious figures. But we are not a religion, and for us to dictate how people are to practice their spiritual life by utilizing set prayers, which are religious prayers, is just simply not something we do. Yeah.
But we say that our Father after every meeting.
But has nothing to do with AA. That's entirely up to the individual group. There are many groups that don't use that prayer at all.
I have no problem with God. I love God,
Sure.
But
No, but these are excellent questions, but you got to remember that the traditions allow each AA group to be totally autonomous.
But every group I've ever been to says that.
But there are groups that don't.
There's some California
From saying serenity prayer at the end.
The serenity prayer is also not an AA prayer. Serenity prayer was written by Reinhold Niebuhr, who was a great theologian. He wrote that prayer for his church in New York City in 1931. And in about 1940 or 42, somebody discovered that prayer, somebody in AA, and thought it was quite appropriate. And by the way, we only have a small part of the prayer. There are 3 or 4 more stanzas to that prayer. But it's become so universally used in AA and in other 12-step groups that it's become known as an AA prayer. It's not. And it is entirely optional whether the group uses those prayers or not. Most groups choose to do it just to just because they do. You know, a lot of people expect it. And they're good prayers, nothing wrong with them. But they are not AA. Neither one. Does that answer your question?
No, but-
What is your question? Restate your question.
I don't know, I just, to tell you the truth, to me, and this is only just me, my own thoughts, you know, to me, it kind of is, to me, it is religious. To me,
A lot of people feel that way, that this is my expression, my religious expression I get from AA. Many people feel that way.
you know.
But it is not a religion. It is a entirely personal thing to accept it as my personal religion, which is what I do.
But can you see how that would be confusing to anybody? Like, you know, when I came into AA, they told me, you know, just, you know, work the steps, you know, give your life to God, love God, pray to God, God, you know. And I was like, okay, you know, I was like on my knees anyway, so I might as well pray while I'm down there. But, and it did, you know, and I was ready. But just, I mean, somebody that was like, I can see how that would really be confusing, because it's like, it is religious, but it's not supposed to be religious, and blah, 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 but really it is.
Well, what if you're talking about the 12 steps, or the way the fellowship conducts itself, or what are you talking about that makes it a religion?
God. I mean, I'm not saying it is a religion, but I'm just saying that there is religion involved.
Well, there's no doubt that most of our roots go back to first century Christianity.
Right.
If you want to read about us, read the Book of James. Go back a little further and read the Old Testament.
Right.
Read the Proverbs. Read the Psalms. You're going to find us all the way through there. Go read Prophet Micah. They asked Micah, what does God expect of us? He says, God expects you to be just, to be merciful, and walk humbly with your God. That's what we talk about, isn't it? So sure, there's no way to avoid the fact that our roots are steeped in religious and theological belief systems. No doubt about it. But we are not a religion in the sense that we demand any kind of compliance with any set of rules, any sort of catechism, there just aren't any rules. And a lot of us accept AA as the only religion we need, if you want to call it that. In my own personal belief system, it's worked beautifully for me all this time. And I don't know, I mean, maybe if I'm wrong, I suppose I'm going to be in a lake of fire for eternity. But at this point, I don't think I'm wrong.
The lake of fire.
The lake of fire, yeah. Yeah.
Is there a difference between spirituality and religion?
I think most religions, Jeff, are essentially spiritual, but that covers a wide range of belief systems. Most religions, though, have specific beliefs which you must adhere to in order to be a member.
So we don't do that.
And we do not have such a thing here.
So that's the difference.
That's certainly one of the differences anyway. David was next.
My name is David. I'm an alcoholic. And just a side note about that St. Francis prayer. I have never seen it worded exactly the way it is in the 12 and 12 in any other book. I've looked in a lot of different prayer books to try to find that exact wording. It seems to me it's a little bit uniquely worded in the 12 and 12. And I viewed it as kind of a suggestive thing. And the sentiment of it is very spiritual and very beautiful. And he kind of used the suggestion in a way as a meditation, as something that is getting a person out of
Yeah, he's saying a lot of us do this. The problem is,
the point is that I don't see it as a requirement. I don't see it saying that as a requirement.
Of course not, but there are plenty of groups, plenty of people who teach that as the 11-step prayer, and it's included in their group protocol.
So that's the group. Any group can do that.
Yeah, they can do it.
Any group can do that.
They can do it.
Well, then, someone like me who's just starting out, what if I end up in a group that's teaching something that's not in the big book, even though I have read the big book all the way through, because that was your first requirement of me.
Yes.
Now, but that, I don't remember everything that's in there, I've only read it once. So how am I going to be, what percentage would I be led off the right path? On
Well,
what groups to go to and not go to?
One of the things I believe you were taught was when you're not sure, you ask, where is that in the big book? Because if it's not there, forget about it. I mean, it may do a lot of people a lot of good, but you don't need it. What you need is in the book. Yeah.
Very quickly, the reason that I believe that the 12 and 12 was written was because in 1948, the little red book came out in 2008 and sold it to Hazelton. And I think the general office went into a panic and they inspired the 12 and 12.
Well, that's good knowledge of history. Yeah. Same about the same time, you know, the 24-hour book was written. And that was offered to AA, and they stupidly turned it down, so that was given to Hazelton. And then Hazelton's made a fortune off that book ever since. By the way, if you have the 24-hour book, if you want to compare it with another book, you'll see one or the other of them is a direct plagiarism. There's a book called God Calling. You'll find word for word, same stuff. Somebody copied from somebody in there. Yeah.
Lewis, an alcoholic. Say, for me, religion is somebody else's preconceived notion of God and their ritualistic practice and their approach to get a relationship with their God. For spirituality is finding a God, as I understand him, and tapping into beneficial flow or interaction that I can get with that power, as I understand it.
I think that's very astute. That's pretty darn close to what I think.
The purpose of the book, as far as I'm concerned, you know, because that's what I come to AA for, is to find out what this book's got to offer me and how it can enrich my life. It says clearly the purpose of this book is to help you to find the power greater in yourself. You know, to
Sure.
You know, by which to grow.
Yep.
And so the purpose of that book for me is basically how to get physically, mentally, and spiritually discovered with any defects that might exist, how to groom and get rid of them. You know, that gets me ready to practice step 10, 11, and 12. You see, because of all of my thinking and all of my preconceived notions, I'm really not prepared or obtained the position to become an instrument, a channel of God's will until I have a full understanding and I have fully conceded to my innermost self the first 9 steps.
Good. One other distinction that appears to me is that we don't enforce anything by fear. In fact, we say that fear, we don't stay sober based on fear. Fear is our enemy, and we do everything we can do to get rid of fear and to let faith grow to a point where fear no longer rules us. It seems to me that most religions have as a basic whip over people who are members is the fear of some kind of punishment or whatever that fear may be. Personally, I don't like that. That really bugs me. So, I get to do what so many do. I go to AA meetings, I pray, I meditate, I take inventory, and I help others, and it works just fine. Now, I don't have any problem because I do believe when I get a chance to talk to God, I'm talking to God. That's my belief. Yes.
Yeah, I've heard religion is for people who are afraid that they're going to go to hell.
Yeah.
And spirituality are for people who have been through hell.
And that's, I believe that too. But you see, now somebody gave me a bumper sticker. It says, if you live your life as if there is no God, you better be right.